Okay, so we're gonna start this conversation. As I said before, the goal of the Lead Commission of Common Sense Media and always of the Annenberg retreat at Sunnylands is to have sessions that are not only fascinating, but wind up with some concrete recommendations that actually become actionable and lead to policy changes. And that's not easy to do. We try to do them in Sunnylands generally in meetings of 18 to 20 people, and we really try to have this Sunnylands process that we're about to use here as a midpoint discussion which moves the conversation forward. It's harder to do with 100 people. But still, I think we're going to try to do it, and I've asked Rebecca Randall and Jeff Mao to start us off as two people with Common Sense Media who are thinking very carefully about these issues. So what I've asked each of them to do is to come up with about 3 actionable ideas that came out of the conversation this morning. And then we'll go to the rest of you for this, and we're not going to strike anything down as a bad idea. We're not going to argue about ideas. The point is, what ideas should be on the table to think about? And Rebecca's going to continue to keep a running list of these things, and probably many of you are. And of course, everything here is being recorded and tweeted and hashtagged and so forth. So, but let's start with some ideas. Do you want to go first, Jeff?
Sure.
Okay, from Jeff.
So one of the ideas that I heard that came out this morning I think is really critical is a change in the kinds of ways in which we're preparing teachers that I think we really need to look at some more, which was thinking about teachers as curricular designers as opposed to just consumers of curriculum that was created by somebody else. Because I think in a world where we all recognize more differentiated learning that needs to take place and a more dynamic curriculum for kids, teachers need to be prepared and skilled at being able to keep up with that change. And I think one of the challenges they feel today is that that wasn't what they were trained to do. They were trained to deliver something that was handed to them. And they probably do that great, but it isn't the job that they're being asked to do anymore. And so I think really looking at how we can change that paradigm in our preparation programs and in our ongoing professional development programs. How do we make teachers curricular designers and not simply consumers of curriculum?
So if we take an idea like that, then the question would be, how do you, okay, that's an idea, it's maybe a best practice. How do you spread that best practice in some way that makes it more than just an idea that came out of this session?
Right. And then the other piece that I keyed in on was some comments that Sean made about how the professional development delivery models were occurring in his district and how they've resolved to come up with a new model that wasn't just the top-down, the district says on these 3 days we will get together and we're going to cover this topic and this topic and this topic, but really recognize the needs of individual teachers and allowed them more choice, which got into that question of who should be making these decisions and putting that decision right back to the teacher in the same way that we've all been trying to do this with the students, trying to make them the master of their learning and the owner of their learning, and doing the same for our faculty and say, how can we develop systems to allow our teachers to be in charge of their own learning and honors that and respects and supports it, which I think would then avoid what we heard in an earlier panel about kind of avoiding this donut-driven professional development, right? That we shouldn't need the donut to get the teacher to the PD because the teacher should be choosing because that's what they need. And I'm going to hand it off to Rebecca for a third and maybe a fourth idea.
Okay.
So I think along those lines, this concept of the environment in schools and the culture in schools needing to shift. So in order to enable that non-donut driven PD to happen, and in order to personalize learning for teachers, time. We need to address time and how time is allocated, and that's a critical component as part of this. And that could happen through different policies that districts may be making. It also may happen through teacher contracts, but a variety of different ways that schools and districts really need to address the time question. You know, Randy raised a good issue, and this is something that I think we probably all struggle with, was, okay, if we're adding this to our plate, what do we take away? Because we can't add more time in our day. So what does that mean for, as districts, as policymakers, for us to address, again, that time issue? I think along the same lines, the culture needs to shift, and we need to be able to allow more risk-taking. So we talked this morning about failing forward, and it was this concept, I think, that was carried on throughout the day, not only for teacher preparation programs. Punya, Daniel, Deborah all talked this morning about for teacher preparation that it was not just about helping teachers be curriculum designers, not just consumers, but also about being more open and resilient around technology and to try and to fail and to be okay with that and to be resilient and to keep going. And that's in a teacher prep context. In a school context, the culture needs to shift so that risk-taking is okay, so that as administrators we have trust in our teachers not only to help design their own PD, but to trust them to take those risks so they know that if they try something and it doesn't go as well as they had hoped, they're not going to get dinged for that.
So how, do either of you have any ideas of other than just listing these as best practices, of anything that could be done to move those ideas forward?
I think looking at teacher contracts and how time is allocated is important, not only from a contract perspective, but also in a school day. I mean, so Sean brought up just changing lunch duties, changing the fact that there are, committees that they have after school, and what do those committees actually do? Could there be a more collaborative process that takes place after school for professional learning and growth? So I think that those are two ways.
Jeff?
I think when we were talking about, say, helping teachers become curricular designers, that's going to occur very frequently in pre-service programs and in ongoing professional development work. And so what guides and drives those systems, I think, is where we need to be looking. So for the pre-service teacher programs, every state is going to end up having its own licensing program or approval program at the state level that is probably then derived by either a state board, a legislature, the Department of Education, or some combination thereof, or some other governing body. That governing body has the ability then to adjust what their standards are for what makes a qualified teacher preparation program in their state and what those outcomes that they're looking for those programs to create. Because I know that those programs obviously are going to be looking to for that guidance. They're going to say, well, what is the state mandate that we need to be in order for us to be an approved program? And on the professional development side, a lot of the funds that are spent come from states and also come from the federal government. And I think as we look at how we distribute those dollars and what hooks you put on them, that's another great place to be able to add that guidance. So if you want your federal professional development dollars spent in a certain way, the federal government and the Department of Ed has that authority then to be looking at, well, how do we tweak the language that says, okay, these funds are for this purpose. And that's a great place to be able to put in those ideas so that as people are looking to say, okay, well, I want to spend these monies in a compliant way, but I also understand the value proposition here, okay, then I can do that.
Great. Rebecca?
I think another thought, too, about how not to make professional development just one and done and to make it more ongoing throughout the course of a school calendar is certainly online models in the professional learning communities that I talked about this morning, Sean talked a little bit about, and how we get teachers credit for those. So right now, it's butts and seats. It's an in-person professional development model, or even if it's online, you have to have a certificate attached to it at the end. And those are both important, but are there newer models? Can we somehow be giving teachers credit for participating in PLCs and PLNs, for watching videos on the teaching channel? How is it that we're able to give teachers credit that they deserve for engaging in these more collaborative models in their own time and space?
Great. So we have two microphones that are going to be wandering in the audience for your additional comments. I'm going to ask Linda Birch to talk first for a minute, so over here, because I know Linda felt strongly, and she asked the question about time, and that's part of what you guys just raised, was the question of time. How do you actually think about time?
Well, I think that we really explored that deeply here in terms of time during the school year. I posed that question about the summer really because I'm looking for other components of time that might be used more different in a different way. I think there are also
Had you ever heard of the summer camp lobby before, by the way?
I had never heard of the summer camp lobby. Thank you, Randy, for that. One of the other things that I think is really interesting, and I'll bring it up here, it didn't come up today, but I often hear about master teachers in the technology space with every single company that has a product having a summer session in which there are 50 teachers that are trained in Adobe or in Apple, distinguished teachers. And I keep wondering, how do we make that a more efficient system where it becomes something that rises to a national standard where these companies are working together to think about a digital teacher corps across the board? And are there ways in which that can be structured into time, for example, during the summer? So that was my big question around time. But I did want to also point out something that I thought was really important that came out of both panels, which is I think we tend to think about technology and young people and younger teachers having the proficiencies that can be paired with more senior teachers. And I thought what came out of the panel in terms of that isn't necessarily the right model, because there is great expertise in the pedagogy of how to teach, and that what really sounded most compelling was this combination of an instructional coach around technology paired with a teacher who has used technology in the classroom in a way that can be visited, seen, and practiced. And I think Sean was the one that really kind of brought those two things together. So I think the idea of how do we pair teachers that are comfortable with technology with teachers that are not, and make sure that pedagogy and technology come together in a really dynamic way that enhances learning, was another really important message that came out today.
And is Ruth here still? Because I think Ruth talked about that some, how it works in her school district. Ruth, where are you? Oh, yeah. Ruth, maybe you could talk, I don't know how that's afforded, so maybe you could talk about how you fund that, too.
Fund the tech coaches?
Yeah.
Well, I'm in Virginia, and about 10 years ago, we actually had a change in our SOQ, the Standards of Quality, where every school division had to provide one technology coach for every 1,000 students. And so it's, partially state funded to have tech coaches. And it's difficult because, 1,000 students could be spread across, a number of buildings, depending upon how big your buildings are. So, but I only have 2 buildings, and so I'm a little bit more able to, focus on my teachers, because I have only 2 buildings that I have to, I've got 450 in one building and 500 in the other building. So, but it is state mandated, one tech coach for every 1,000 students.
Do many states have that requirement?
Not to my knowledge.
Not to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge.
So that, that could be at least a best practice concept that could be explored here. People with other ideas they want, and there's nothing in this conversation, there's no such thing as a bad idea. We're just trying to put good ideas on the table that we've heard about, please. And if you could identify yourself.
Yes, of course, thank you. Ira Sokowitz from the Learning Games Network. I'd like to put the conversation you began in a context, and I use that word because Deputy Secretary Shelton used that word. The concept of an ecosystem in which professional development is part of the introduction of technology into classrooms, to me, is quite important. And the 2 or 3 of the speakers this morning mentioned an ecosystem. So, for example, the Learning Games Network is both an advocate for and a provider of educational materials. But as a vendor, we need to be working in an ecosystem as we develop the products. We hear from educators, we hear from administrators what they want, what they need, but we're the people producing the PD to be used with our learning games. So if we're not contextually based around the needs and know where and how we're going to fit into those parts of the ecosystem, once again, we're siloed. The teachers are siloed, the administrators are siloed, and there are people who can do some convenings around these ecosystems, but I think it's critical. You have, SETA is here today. What are the ways in which we can start to take a lot of these strands and build them into a woven fabric so it's an ecosystem of need, demand, supply?
I think we have another hand over here I want to call on her, but first of all, to say, I think, Sean, one of the things you were referring to was that Google, you felt, was somehow more receptive to teacher input on products. Is that correct? Could you address that before the woman next to you speaks?
Yeah, well, I was just saying that when I saw their booth at a conference, they were leveraging teachers who had used it in the classroom to explain it to teachers who were interested in doing so. So, I mean, it just seems logical to do it that way, but I thought that was a connector that was missing in some other places.
And then you're going a step further, which is saying that actually in designing the product, the teachers should be more engaged. Is that correct?
Correct. For example, they now have a design challenge where...
Maybe we could bring that, there should be two, I think there's a second mic over here, by the way. Is there another person who could help with that?
For example, in New York City, in the Office of Innovation, they created a design challenge where the school district laid out the parameters of what it is they were seeking technologically, and then had vendors go out and design to their standards, not the other way around.
Is that done, now have other communities done that, or does that become a paradigm
That was,
suggestion?
I think that was a first of its model.
Virginia has done something similar? We do have a woman over here, I'm sorry, I still, but we do have a second mic if somebody wants to carry. Oh, it's down there, I'm sorry. So somebody can circulate that one there, but this one here. Okay.
Yes, so thank you for this thoughtful, open forum. I'm Dara Feldman. I am an Apple Distinguished Educator. I'm a Google Certified Teacher. I'm an NTTI Master Teacher, recovering kindergarten teacher. However, one of the things that's really essential is passion, right? Starting with the passion of the educator. And so when you talk about job-embedded professional development, and we take a model of cooperative learning, such as Jigsaw, we can't be experts at everything. So how can we leverage the passion of individual teachers, educators, broader context, and allow them some flexibility to go out, learn what they're passionate about that's in alignment with their school district, and come back and share in meaningful ways with their colleagues. So that's one, and then they can report out, like in action research, being researching practitioners, and to be able to say, hey, here's a window in from my classroom. We can blog, we can tweet, we can do all that. So we have the technology for that. And then in terms of the ecosystem, there's a wonderful conference that's going to be happening here in DC, National Education Week. And so it is to break down those silos. And it's all going to be about educators on Monday. Tuesday, it's going to be honoring the military. And Wednesday and Thursday is the Thought Leader Summit. Now, my role is to help it be even more embedded with teachers. But let's have everybody work in unity. And where is the voice of our students? Because those are really the ideal clients.
Thank you. I'm sorry, please. Is that working?
Hi, my name is Soraya Shmali, and I'm a writer, and I do a lot of advocacy work related to gender in media and technology. And one of the things that really struck me this morning is that the frame for the conversations we're having is that this technology is somehow neutral and that it's a linear move towards progress. But Silicon Valley, where much of this technology comes from, is not exactly a bastion of diversity. And so I would really like to better understand how, in moving towards implementation, teachers and administrators can get information into the hands of people who need it related to implicit biases, related to representations of gender and race. Because it's not just that the technology arrives, the technology requires interpretation, and it requires critique while it is being implemented, not just on the basis of the content, but also on the structure of the technology. So it seems to me it's really more a question than anything else. What can we do as a community to make sure that pre-existing biases that we know exist are addressed? Because as it is, teachers don't get a whole lot of training, it seems to me, on implicit bias, on classroom interactions. And that will move from the classroom as it exists into the technology as it is expanded.
I want to give Jim Steyer a chance to respond to that. I also want to say that strikes me as also relating to the idea of the ecosystem where you actually are having the communities involved in developing it, because the cultural issues will be different also from community to community, not just the biases you're talking about. Jim?
No, I just think that Soraya's point's a great point. That one and the point that was made earlier about the potential of technology as being increasing the digital divide. I mean, one of the things that was interesting in putting this together, I'm looking at my friend Jim Coulter over there. I mean, one of the biggest things, if we look at what we laid out for LEAD, Jim, right? So we talked a lot to the tech industry when we were trying to get them on the device issue and even on the infrastructure issue. But you are exactly correct about Silicon Valley on big picture. Okay, there are exceptions, but I'm going to generalize here. Number one, this is a huge issue, and you see virtually no leadership from Silicon Valley on this at all. I'm happy to say that as someone who works a lot with the people who run the large companies in Silicon Valley. It's a huge problem. and they're not diverse, and they're not reflective at all of either the population or many other things. Number two, they're not part of this discussion at all. And it was very interesting in listening. And one of the things, remember I can't remember who made the point. I think it was the first panel, Ruth's panel, about how technology could actually increase inequality, and how in schools with low-income kids, it can be actually a negative versus a positive. Again, part of the challenge I think we face, and something that we should really take on to think about, is that broader issue. Because I think of the Silicon Valley people who we interact with all the time. It's a big part of my work. They think about their own kids. They're all going to really fancy either independent schools or fancy private schools. They are going to maybe make sure those schools have good technology and integration into it. This is a huge issue, and if you actually look who's here today, the one group we're never able to get in a big way. I apologize, David Byer. I know you're here, but we don't get Silicon Valley. They're not part of these discussions, and I think they have to be if we're going to make this really serious. And you're right, just because of the long term, if technology is coming out of there, they have to be part of the thinking, and to some extent, these issues of both the inequality issue and the diversity issue have got to be raised to the folks running Silicon Valley as well. I think that's a very, very good
So
point.
let me get some other people into this, but remember, we're trying, this particular session is solution, no, that's great. Okay, no, Jim, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the others are going to be commenting. Please keep in mind, as with questions which are supposed to have a question mark at the end of them, this time there's supposed to be a solution at the end of your comment. Yes. Please.
I'm Cheryl Williams with the Learning First Alliance, and I actually have a solution, but I want to respond to him first. Quickly. It's larger than just Silicon Valley. I mean, this is my third decade of sitting in these meetings, so you have to forgive me. We have huge cultural differences between the public school community, any business. I mean, I go to Chamber of Commerce meetings, and they talk about how, schools won't change, they don't turn on a dime, they don't do... I mean, we get our money from local tax dollars. I mean, the Fed's what? It's like 8%. So, excuse me. I'm not upset, I just drank my soda too fast. So the cultural, I think one of the issues we need is figuring out how to bridge cultural differences between people of like-minded people. I think all of us want our public schools to be better. And it's good for business for our public schools to be better. So if there's some way we can think about bridging cultural differences that we're mutually respectful, because in the end, the public schools are the ones who don't get the respect because of the huge challenges. We're looking at the teacher of the year who has 150 English. I did 40 years ago, I had 150 English students. I thought things had gotten better. So, it's just a huge culture difference. It's now my solution. The Learning First Alliance is a coalition of 14 national K-12 public education organizations. And one of them is called Learning Forward. They're the staff developers. They've developed a whole list of standards on what good professional development looks like in the context of public schooling, whether it's about technology, whether it's about the latest things in science, whatever. So, there are professional educators who are working to put the information out for others to see, use, and do.
So I want to ask you a question about that, Cheryl. Are some of those requirements embedded in accreditation requirements, certification requirements, et cetera?
Well,
and should they be?
Yes, they should be. But also, I think to be fair, the CAPE, the certification group, has been working for years to advise what's best for certifying teachers from their college prep institutions. One of the cultural realities is there are 14,000 school boards who do the policies. And so from a national level, and we talk about this all the time, what can we as national leaders, whether we're COSIN or ISTE or NEA or AASA, what is our role in helping change to move forward when it's all locally funded, locally governed, locally implemented? And that's where the solutions become very difficult to talk about.
And I think if I'm right, Jim Coulter, we're not assuming the solutions are necessarily federal solutions. We're looking for ideas that could be anywhere from the most local levels to state level to a national standard, whatever the mix may be. Keith?
Keith Kruger with COSIN. This is just a little solution, but I see a lot of professional associations in here. And you were talking about the ecosystem, and I think you go to most conferences and it looks like a panel of best solutions. And it's like manna that came down from heaven. You get this nice, shiny, bright solution. The problem is what we want to create is an environment that talks about all the little steps that were continuously improved upon. So one little thing we did is we've created a fail fest at our conference, which you're supposed to bring something that didn't work out the way you, and what you learn from it, because we're not celebrating failure, we're celebrating learning from your failure. So that's something that a lot of places could do.
It's a good point, because it's one of the things actually you guys were talking about, and then the question is how do you implement that in some way of celebrating risk-taking where you learn from the risk.
So kind of going back to your original question relating to matters of equity in terms of race, gender, and so forth. If you bring it back to like teacher preparation programs, teacher education programs, theoretically, there should be units within foundations courses and methods courses that focus on social justice, for example, critical pedagogy, and culture relevant pedagogy. Whether or not that actually happens, I don't know. But when it does happen, and it needs to happen more often, those conversations need to be married to things like through a lens that is informed by technology. So in other words, if you explore matters of social justice within the classroom and how to address those issues, right, it needs to be done also through that lens of technology to see how technology can either support or hurt or whatever it is, but it needs to happen. And it needs to happen more often. So faculty need to be more attuned to that.
And some of those kind of standards also can be state accrediting standards too, which they are. Please. Can you help with that for a second? Thanks, Michelle.
I was trying to think about focus, and because it's clearly we need learning environments, we need more powerful school environments that can become coherent in moving this. But if I think about what Jim talks about product and ecosystem and the companies and learning science, what if there was a focus on something really critical across the country? For example, stumbling blocks in mathematics that are very common, needed for the pathway to algebra all the way through, which are fractions, ratios. It sounds extremely concrete, given what people are talking about here, but it is an enormous problem and a deep problem of teaching and learning. So when you think about professional development and what technology could enable, you think about a focus that brought together in industry, teachers, anyone, in the kind of design challenge or something like this, that actually then propelled through an example why this technology is important.
Great, thank you. Are there any other suggestions, please?
Hi, I'm Fran Gleck. I'm with Baltimore County Public Schools. This seems very loud. I'm fortunate to work under some incredible leadership in our district. We have a very youthful and energetic superintendent. And a couple of things that we've done that I think are proposed solutions. The first is that twice a year we have what we call a partner meeting. And we invite our vendor partners to come to our district and hear our story. And we talk about what we're doing. We talk about how we see their role in our process, not our role in their process. And they laugh at me because I told the story that we had kind of dug a moat around Baltimore County. And if they didn't have the way to come over our drawbridge, they weren't coming. And so we've been able to forge some really strong connections with vendor partners as a result of that. And it's an ongoing conversation. We have a new partnership with Common Sense Media. Thank you. And they'll be joining us in our partnership meeting in a few weeks. The other thing is that as a district, we've made a really concerted effort to have a very open and honest conversation about diversity. And we call it Courageous Conversations. All of our leadership has gone through it. We're bringing it into classrooms. If you know anything about Baltimore, Baltimore is an incredibly changing dynamic in regard to socioeconomic status and race. And so we have teachers in our classrooms who have been there for a really long time, but it's not the Baltimore County that they used to know. We ring Baltimore City, and so our challenges are very similar to those in Baltimore City. And so for us to have that conversation happen across our whole district enables us to make sure that we try to mitigate some of those issues where bias might unintentionally present itself in things that we're doing. So those are my suggestions.
And so how would somebody else follow your lead? What would be the recommendation that LEAD might incorporate based on your experience?
Well, we're open to being part of the learning that's going on across the whole nation. So paying attention to what's happening in Baltimore County Public Schools, and that's not out of self-promotion, that's out of the fact that we all grow and learn together, and I think that all of us who are engaged in this really meaningful work have our own professional learning network from state to state. So making contact with someone in our district, we hope that we're in the beginning stages of our one-to-one implementation in 10 schools, as Sean talked about. So paying attention to kind of what we're doing. We've only had students in classrooms for 3 weeks, even though it feels like 3 years right now. But we really are sort of beginning to tell our story nationally, following my superintendent, Dallas Dance, who's a rock star in his own right. We really are open to working with anybody.
Great. Let me get one last suggestion, and then we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're coming back with starting the afternoon panels.
My name is Pat Wasley. I'm the CEO of the Teaching Channel, and I want to go back to the issue of teacher preparation. And with, I've been the dean of 2 colleges of education and have been a university faculty member, so I want to acknowledge that I'm about to make a controversial statement. I think that colleges of education started by suggesting that courses were the ways in which people learn to become a good teacher, and that's been the currency of the realm, and that's where actually the strength lies in colleges of ed. And then they added an internship in order to acknowledge that people need to practice before they begin. For the last 5 or 6 years, we've had school districts building their own teacher education programs called residencies, and they flipped that formula. They said the work that happens inside schools is the most important work, and so we're going to give longer, more in-depth internships for the course of a year. And then what they've also done is make courses available, and courses are sort of the secondary focus. So I think it's actually time for us to come up with the third model. I think it's third way's the charm, right? Or third time's the charm, because I think neither of those managed to accomplish as yet giving people the knowledge they need, the fundamental knowledge they need, and the practice. So I think we ought to rethink it and start embedding the knowledge that people need to have inside an internship and start over. And I think also it's true, and I have been the deliverer of outmoded courses for many years, that much of the coursework that we give in universities is out of date and needs to be rethought as well. So we need to rethink the internship, rethink what it is people need to know, and start again to create a model of teacher preparation that's really dynamic and vibrant and made much more possible by technology.
Thank you, and thank all of you for participating in what we're calling the Sunnylands process. 5-minute break, and then we're going to continue with our next panel.